All right, folks, we finally have finished Chapter 6 and we're moving into Chapter 7. So goodbye Active Record and hello Action Pack. And what's cool about moving to this chapter is we're going to finally start working with the other two components in the MVC architecture. If you haven't figured it out, when we work with the database stuff and we work with all the stuff that we were doing in Chapter 6 and the chapter that preceded, that's all based on the model, the M of the MVC. So at this point, we're going to start switching back over to actually doing more web-related stuff. And that's going to be working with the view and the controller, as I just mentioned. Now, one thing that we haven't done in a while, really since I think Chapter 4 or 5, is actually start our Rails server and actually take a look at our website. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to navigate into my projects folder and I'm going to start up the server, and hopefully you guys can do the same or you can just watch, whatever. But what I'm going to demonstrate to you is part of what the MVC architecture gives us that we're going to be working on, and also kind of help you understand some of the aspects of it. All right, once your server is up and running, go ahead and bring up your browser. And if you guys remember how this all works, in order to get to your application, you just type localhost 3000. Oh, and that's not what I was hoping to see, right? Yeah, well, what I was hoping to see is my application, right? So what it's showing me is the default Ruby page, but I don't know if you guys remember the way that we set this up. In order to see the home page, we actually have to append to the URL the word articles. So this should, I guess I'm saying this a little pensively, this should bring up our application. Now, I don't know if you guys have discovered this when you first launch your Rails server and you try to hit it and bring it up. Sometimes it doesn't respond right away. And that's on the first launch. If I were to do that again, if I go back, do a refresh, and then type in that same URL, it will load much quicker this time. It's just that first initiation of the server running. Now notice what we're seeing in our screen here is basically kind of like a dump from the database, really. And the question is, where the heck does that come from, right? And why is the URL not include the name of a file? Well, that's all due to that MVC architecture. So really what's happening is we send out a request to the server interprets that and it looks at the URL that we're sending, which is /articles. And somewhere in what we call a controller, there is a route that determines when we type in that URL where we're going and what's happening. Now that might just be taking us directly to what we call a view, which renders a page, or in this case, it talks to the model for articles, it pulls back the information from the database, it takes that and it puts it inside of a view that has some HTML or something in it that makes it look like this, and then pushes it back to the browser. So that's all kind of happening on the back end, and kind of one of the byproducts of working with this MVC architecture is the simple URLs that we get. And you'll also notice as we ramp up this technology that part of it's going to be indicating what thing we're asking the controller to do, and then in other circumstances we might throw in some additional stuff at the end here that really is invoking Rails and Ruby to do a particular action. It's kind of the equivalent of passing a parameter or an argument to a function. And really what we are doing in essence is passing it to the controller, and the controller receives it and says, what are we going to do with this? All right, so that's kind of a little like practical preview of what we're about to learn. And they kind of lump these two components together, and I think that's not necessarily a problem. Some approaches will teach each separately, but you kind of need both to work together to be able to see the results of what you're doing, and that's why the author here does that. Now, the part that actually makes it do something, and look at the word controller and view, they lump it together and they call it action action pack, and that really actually encompasses two things. And the first one that we're going to look at is the controller. Now, the little correlation that they're making here in the book is if you think of the CD player in your car as an example of an application that does something. And, it's got a bunch of controls on it that you push to do certain things, and you turn it on and off. But basically, you put like a disc in it, and you hit play. Or you click the next button or the eject button, and every time you hit one of those, you expect something to happen. That's kind of what the controller does. So, for example, if we're on a website and we click new article, we expect it to take us to the spot where we can create that new article. If we hit stop on the CD player, we expect it to stop without any thought as to what actually happens when you hit the button. So what we're concerned with is what happens when you hit that button. So a lot of that is really triggered by events. Now, the stuff that you're seeing here in this example really is not something we're going to be typing in. Just please keep that in mind. It's just really an example of what happens in a controller. So a controller very often will have a class file like this, and notice that the class file will have methods defined. So a defined method called play, stop, fast forward, rewind, and eject to match up with all the buttons or possible actions that are available to you. So now what each one of those methods will do, that's going to be determined by the application you're building, but that's kind of the approach here. So we're going to be building a class file, and then we're going to have methods within it that are going to allow us to trigger those actions. The other part of the equation here is working with action view, and these two components always work in tandem. And as we scroll down here, you're going to see a really rudimentary example of an HTML file. It's got a body section. Obviously, they're omitting a lot of the components, but ultimately you see in the middle of the document there, those of you that have taken the ASP.NET class will recognize an ASP.NET-like delimiter within the brackets, right? That basically tells you that you're running some sort of scripting code other than the HTML. Very much like ASP.NET, very much like PHP, it's code that's inserted within HTML. So, and really what it is, it's Ruby code. Just like the Ruby code that we've been either typing into a file or typing at the command prompt, and we're inserting it into HTML, and now the HTML is being rendered with the execution of the Ruby file. So this view would run that Ruby command, and it would bring back some information that would get populated. And actually, this is exactly what's happening in our application. We are running the articles page, and in the background, it's generating HTML for us, and you should always be in the habit of doing this too. And we don't see the Ruby code behind it. We just see the result of the Ruby code, all the assets that are being pulled in. But ultimately, somewhere there's a script that goes out to the database, pulls in each record, displays it on the screen as HTML, and you guys should start to recognize now when we see like this each command, it's kind of the Ruby's equivalent of a for each loop, right? So it's saying articles each, so for each article you are going to go ahead and create a list item, so this is an unordered list, and we're going to list each article and each article title. It's pretty easy to decipher, but that's basically what happens. When it hits the browser, of course, what's going to happen is it's going to render as HTML. You won't see that Ruby code. You just see the result of the Ruby code. All right. This whole approach is really what we call embedded Ruby, and you should have learned in PHP, I'm hoping I taught you this if you took it with me, or ASP, that when you intermix the languages, you're really doing embedded coding. And if you're comfortable with PHP and ASP, it's really not that much of a stretch. It's just a different language. So that part of it is pretty cool, and hopefully you'll be comfortable with it pretty quickly. Now what's a little different though is the way the tags are used and how we implement the language. So there's that little bit of a leap. Now the one thing I do want to point out is that there's two different forms of the tags that we use. Notice the one is just starting and ending with the % signs, and one of them also includes a little equal sign into the mix. Alright, so notice that they break it down and they say, in the example in the preceding section, the loop is constructed within evaluation embedding tags, meaning just the % signs, and the article's title is printed using output embedding tags where there's the equal sign. So the difference basically is that here we're just running a Ruby command. That's the beginning of running the loop. That doesn't output anything to the screen, we're just running Ruby. This one, however, will output to the screen. It is going to be inserted between HTML tags and render. So that's why we have the equal sign there. Alright, another component to working with ActionPack is what we call helpers. And helpers are basically little tiny applications or class files that perform very specific little functions that, as the term sounds, help us perform certain tasks. So like you'll invoke the controller to perform a certain action, and that might call upon a helper app. And the reason we create a separate app is because, you know, maybe the app formats the text, and that's something that happens on all of our pages. There's no reason to write it separately for every instance where it's needed. It's better to write it as a separate component. Kind of, you know, think of in terms of like includes for PHP, right? You do includes that might just connect to the database, or you might do an include that just pulls in a header, for example. And here we call these helpers. The other thing that's interesting is what we call routing. And then routing, and they're giving an example here, working with a language like ASP. With ASP, you will still see a file extension. And in addition, you'll see a question mark and very often some sort of a parameter that's being passed. And really, that's exactly what's happening here. We're sending off to the application, we're saying, go to this page, pass to ID, whatever, it might be a variable or a method, this value. It receives it, it does something with it, and then it spits back a page. And that, if you guys, you know, working with WordPress, you often see that type of a thing going on, and you should recognize that when you have a question mark, you're doing a get with the URL. So you're seeing the stuff that you're passing to the application. Now that's not a very friendly looking URL, but really what's happening is there's a page that's receiving it, it's executing code by virtue of the parameters that we are passing. That is in essence routing, because if we are showing an article that's got a particular ID, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on that ultimately is pulling up the article that we want. Now, that's not a URL that people are going to remember, though. So that's kind of interesting. All right, now we're moving on to another concept here. And before I talk about this one, I want to give you a little background as to how we're proceeding. Basically, we're talking about ActionPack as a whole, controllers, views, helpers, routing, and now we're talking about this other thing here called REST and RESTful design. And this is a thing that is, in a sense, really more principle than it is actually technology. And what happens is we're using what we think of as a common set of actions that we always do in applications. Those of you that are been in the program here for a while are recognizing the fact that very often applications, whether they're web-based or regular operating system applications, we very often interface with a database, And the common database actions are the CRUD operations: create, retrieve, update, and destroy. And REST uses that as like a foundation for the things that it's doing. I'm going to take a quick pause here for a second. All right, now what's important about REST as a concept is really what it intends to do is to help us in the form of additionally cleaning up our URLs. In other words, where some of the actions that we're going to take are also going to be embedded in the URL. And very often, what's happening is we're just kind of mapping the CRUD operations to the things that HTTP as a protocol does natively. So you guys already know what GET and POST are, but HTTP also has these other options available for moving data, and those translate to the REST approach, where you notice they're adding a couple things like update and delete, and then notice create, read, update, delete, the whole CRUD operations. And in very much this fashion, we often refer to this whole thing as like a REST API, and a lot of it is intended to do those actions. All right, so let's take a look at this little diagram here that shows you kind of how the thing works. And it kind of steps through the process. So it says first, Rail receives a request from the outside world. So you got a browser, somebody's clicking through or typing in a URL. Routing picks the request and determines which controller we're going to use and then the action that we're going to take. So it receives it. It says, oh, you typed article. All right. In that case, go here. So we go to the article controller. And then what happens, and notice this is a really important thing to latch onto here. It says a new controller object is instantiated. So when we are trying to invoke the article controller, what it actually does is it pulls from the model and creates an instance of the article that we then work with. So it's not adjusting what we're pulling from data-wise, it's just creating a copy of it. And that's part of why we use that @ symbol at the front, and you'll see that as we go. All right, so it instantiates a new object and an action method is called. So what the action is will depend. Now notice that when you take that action, it also starts to do all the CRUD operations with the model. Now that does not necessarily mean it's actually touching the database, but it might be. So it's one of those it depends kind of situations. And as it says in step 4, the controller interacts with the model, usually performing a CRUD operation like reading a file, updating a file, whatever. And then ultimately, after it pulls that back, performs the action, it will then pull in a template file. And you see this file here, it's got this weird like double file extension. We move into the views folder for articles, and it's got a template file. This is what it is. It's basically an HTML file that has an ERB extension. The ERB stands for Embedded Ruby. And then what happens is we receive our information, whatever that embedded Ruby needs, hopefully we're sending it to it, and then it builds the HTML page, and then the action view sends it back to the browser built as HTML. Not too much different than what like PHP or ASP does. The difference though is where we're building the controller, the model, and the view, and we're working with all those components separately. You can do this very same type of architecture in ASP.NET. You can do this architecture in PHP. You can do it in a lot of different languages. But that's not usually the first thing you learn. You usually learn the rudimentary way of doing it. But remember, the whole reason that we do this is so that we have what we call separation of concerns, so that we don't need to rewrite the same code. I mean, if we're updating and retrieving data, that's the same kind of operation. There's no real reason to write a separate file to do that every time, or take a method and add the same operation to it over and over again. that's where we would pull that in from an external file. So we have these smaller files that we deal with that each has a specific function, and then also gives us one spot to make an edit as opposed to many spots to make an edit. And notice here that when you're not using MVC and you get these really large applications, basically what happens is the code becomes a lot more difficult to maintain. So you get these really big, complex architectures. Now, I know some of you here have had advanced PHP with me, and I want you to think back to when we were building a blog application in that class, and how when we started to do it, we would also create an instance of like an article or whatever to manipulate instead of actually writing separate files. And it's really kind of the same approach. All right, so let's now turn our attention to actually working with controllers. Now the controllers, remember, we have a couple of different aspects to it. The first part that we're looking at here in the book is working with routes. All right, so part of what happens when we type a URL in a Ruby on Rails application is we'll end up with something that looks like this. So you'll have the root URL, and then you'll have what looks like a folder structure that has absolutely nothing to do with the folder structure. Nothing at all. And what it's doing is, in essence, this. We're doing a get command, and the controller is the first part of the URL. Anything that follows that first one is going to be one of the actions or one of the methods that's inside that controller. And then we have additional parameters that might be, instead of having that question mark ID equals a number, we just have ID and then we throw the number at it, or we just throw the number at it and it knows what to do with it because of how we set up our application. So in this case, if we set up a route, we might do something like get teams home, and what that does is it pulls up an index page. And I know the syntax is a little weird at first, but you'll start to latch onto it when you see the pattern. Here's an example where they're actually doing getting the controller to run a search method, and then we're feeding a query to it. And what is the query? Well, it depends on what we're throwing in, but the result of this would look something like that. So we go to the website, we're going to the Teams page or site, we're invoking the search function, and what are we searching for? We're searching for Toronto. So you see the difference in how the URL looks. All right, and then when you start to recognize these patterns from an MVC application, you'll go to websites and you'll look at the URL, and all of a sudden you go, aha, that's an MVC application. And that can apply to really any technology that's driving it underneath. But that type of a URL structure is common to all MVC applications. And that's one of the advantages of working with it, because it's a clean URL. There's no weird file extensions to remember, no weird question marks or equal signs or anything like that. So that is a useful thing. Now the other thing that you can do with those routes is you can actually set them up and then give them a name, so that you can even simplify your URL further. So this would result in a URL of this fashion. And then you can add additional directives, such as link to search, and give it a search path. So if it's got a certain spot it's going to go to, you can actually direct it within your file. The user does not have to know any of this. All they want is that it works, right? And they don't have complicated URLs to remember. Now in terms of what happens when you write a piece of code like that, here's an example of the output. So if you have this in your embedded Ruby file, it's going to output something like this. It's going to say, oh, well, this is a link to, well, that's done with an anchor tag and an href. And because we're working relative to our own application, notice that we start with a /, meaning it's relative to the root of our project. And then it goes to the Teams controller. It runs the search method. All the user sees is the search path, which in this case is set to search. That's the word. And that the correlation here is this word to that word. That's how it gets there. All right, the other thing that you can do, and this leverages this whole REST approach, is the fact that you can kind of preset a lot of pathways through the application. So, and I want you to be really acutely aware of what's going on here too, because you're noticing that we have article and we have articles. And remember that Rails applications kind of dynamically understand that the singular and plural form of something when you're referring to a single article, and that's what they're doing here, an article with a specific ID, as opposed to all of the articles, and once again, it's not picking out a specific one, so the singular and the plural applies here. And then you're also taking it where you're looking at a specific ID and that you're going to edit it. Notice that what you're saying right in the URL that you're going to edit, you betcha, that's exactly what we're doing. So that's kind of neat. Or if we're creating a new one, that's directly in the URL as well. It takes you to the page that brings up the form that allows you to create a new one. And you remember with an MVC architecture, we're doing all these common CRUD operations. All that stuff is automatically built. Whenever you're doing any sort of interface with the database, it assumes you're going to create, retrieve, update, and destroy. So it creates those things automatically. All right, so let's get a little bit of a look here at how we would work with what we call named routes relative to the articles that we're working with. So notice that we're looking at both the get and the post here, and then farther down we're using the other HTTP request objects that we don't normally associate, but they do happen in the background, and that is put, patch, and delete. And then when you actually put in a named route, for example, they're showing here that an article's path will basically send you to the index page. But if we're doing it as a post, there is an assumption that happens where it assumes that you're doing a create, because with a get, you're asking for something. With the post, you're hiding it in the URL, so it makes the assumption that, oh, well, you're not looking to see it, you're looking to create it. So you see that little difference that happens. The same thing happens when you use these other weirder directives that we haven't used before, the put and the patch, where there's an assumption that you're doing an update. And when you do a delete, obviously, there's an assumption that you're doing a destroy. Now notice also in the named route here where we're prefixing with edit and new, and then it invokes a different controller action. So these are actions that are written that we would be working with. Now this is kind of interesting. It says you can list all the available routes in your application by calling the rake routes command from the terminal. All right, so that's one thing you can do. Or you can actually just click on this link if you want to check it out. So, for example, it recognizes what application we're running, and this is something that's built into Rails. It doesn't magically happen, but it's showing you all the helpers, what HTTP object request protocol we're using, what the path is, and what action is being taken by the controller. We didn't create any of this stuff. This was done all automatically. But the moment we built our application, these things were created. Has all the CRUD operations, and it was all done automatically for us. And that's an important thing to know as well. All right, now we're finally getting to the point where we're going to do a little bit of work. And the first file that we're going to work on is our routes file. So let's bring up a folder where your application is located. And it's not on my Google Drive or my D Drive. And actually, before you start coding, let's do this. I'm going to go ahead and stop. And actually, I don't have to stop my server. I'm going to make a copy of the current status of my blog, and I'm going to paste it back in here. You guys should be used to this process by now. And then I'm going to rename it so that it says Chapter 6 complete. Meaning a starting point for Chapter 7. All right, so now we can go into our application folder, and it wants us to go to config and then to the routes file. Notice that the routes file is a Ruby file, and let's open that up in an editor of some sort. And you'll notice that there's some stuff already within that file. What they want us to do is add to it this bolded line. So let's go ahead and do that. Notice that resources articles is already there. They also have a little bit of comments there. You can get rid of that if you want. And I'm going to add the command in the same spot where they have it. And I'm noticing a couple of differences here in the header of this Ruby file. Notice that here in the book, apparently the syntax has changed from Rails 4 to Rails 5. And my suggestion is don't change it to the old syntax. I mean, you could probably change it, it'll still work. I would leave it at whatever the application is natively generating because it helps to minimize problems. All right. But what we're doing here is we're setting a root location for the site, and what it's setting it to is articles index. Now we don't know what that it really is quite yet. We assume it's like the index page, which it kind of is. But let's just leave it at that for now. So go ahead and save your work. But before we can actually make this do something, we have to actually make some additional adjustments. So let's go ahead and take a look at this particular file. This is app controllers article controller. So back up to the root, app controllers articles controller. This is another one of these that was automatically created when we did a generate command using the scaffolding, and that's one of the advantages of doing scaffolding. This is something you can also do in any form of an MVC application. So if you learn like ASP.NET MVC, the scaffolding does a very similar thing. It creates all the common things automatically. So notice inside here some of the things that already pre-exist. For one, we do have an index method already defined. That is done by default. Notice also that it's got a show, that's a retrieve, right? A new, create, edit, update, create. Well, that's kind of like new, right? And notice that some of these have predefined code in here. The other thing that I want you to pay careful attention to is when we're doing some of these commands, they end up generating a certain type of code. In this case, this one is being formatted to HTML, while this one is being formatted to JSON. Now, you guys remember what JSON is? What does JSON stand for? J-S-O-N. Right. Everybody in the class is speaking up. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's just a format for sending key value pairs through JavaScript. So instead of having like a long XML file, we'll have something that has a name, and then it'll say like name equals this, or last name equals that, and it's all between curly brackets. It's just a really nice concise form of passing data. So that's why you see that. You also see some conditional statements here, And as you scroll down, you'll also see that there's a destroy. There's even a section that's private that you cannot access from external to the application, meaning that you can't type in a URL and trigger these to happen. These can only happen from within this application. And that's done for very specific reasons. But that is the file that we're looking at. And that's essentially what the book is trying to have us do right here, is to look at how this works. They have examples of what all the URLs look like that might trigger this particular method to execute. So notice here we have a get, and it's just articles. And what does that trigger? That triggers the index. If we have one that says get, and it's articles/1, what do you think it shows? The first article. See how that works? Etc. So, if you look at this one where we have articles 1 edit, that would pull back the first article and put us into edit mode so that we could change it. So that's just a little bit of a preview of how that all works. Now they have a complete dump of the file here, which we were just looking at in our editor, so there's no work to be done here. But that is, remember, done automatically when you do that generate controller and it runs the scaffolding. That's what it's doing. It's building out all that stuff. It does it all automatically. Why does it do it? Because it's a convention. The convention is we're interacting with data and models. Data very often does those basic operations. The other thing that we're going to look at here is back to the articles controller file. And if you take a look at that, what it's trying to have you do is just start to identify, for example, I mean, it's not having you look at the whole thing, but what it's really having you look at is this part of it. So this part of it is really the part where we are taking article.all. What do you suppose that does? Loads all the articles. And it's loading it into an instance of articles. So it's creating a copy of all of it and loading it into memory. That's what it's doing. So anytime you have an instance variable, it's always preceded by an @ sign, which is kind of nice because a lot of languages don't do that. You just set up a variable and you're not really sure that it's what it is by just looking at it, but here you can identify it real quickly. And notice that what they're doing here is, once again, they're having us look at that URL that we were doing. You can just go ahead and click it in your book and it brings up what we already know to look at. And that's because of the route that we have and the controllers that we have defined. Now, the other thing that you can do, notice, is you have the capability to also add .json to it, and go ahead and click on that. And then you're going to see what it's doing is it basically hashes the file and outputs it. So you're actually seeing a dump of the data as opposed to a pretty little HTML file. If you take a look at the page source, well, it's exactly the same thing. It's just throwing text back at the screen. But if any one of these entries here, this is one individual entry from the articles database, then notice that the whole listing is encapsulated with square brackets, meaning it's an array of arrays, basically. But this particular format here, I'm just going to copy part of this and drop it into Notepad++ just so we can see it a little bit more clearly. And then maybe this will start to jog loose some cobwebs in terms of how JSON operates. Because usually when you do JSON, you end up seeing something really that looks more like this, where usually the stuff is all put on separate lines. And notice that each line basically has what we call a key value pair. Kind of like the equivalent of like this is the column title and this is the value that goes into the column in the database. So you kind of see how that works. That's how JSON works. And if, when you're working with JSON, you can actually just dump the data like that, or you can actually, if you wanted, give it a variable name and set it equal to all of that data, and then you can refer to any part of it that way. But that's JSON, just a little refresher. So it's another way to do a database dump. The thing that's interesting in the book, though, look at what they're doing here. Oh, and I lost my page. Is they have you click on the JSON and you see the raw version of it. But do you notice that they actually have here an XML output? Should we try that? Do you guys think we'll see anything? No. No, we don't. Because that's not defined. That format for conversion is not defined. However, if we were to add that format as an available option, we would be able to generate this type of output. Now, in the past, doing the JSON would convert it to XML, but JSON really has gained significantly in popularity in the last couple of years, and I think rightly so, mostly because it's just really efficient. And it works beautifully with JavaScript and therefore with all web technologies. All right, I think we're at the point where we're about due for a break, so we're going to pause here for a bit, and I may or may not start a new video. I guess we'll find out if you have to look at a separate one. So let's take a break.